Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reed. I'm the clinical director and co-founder of Evoke Therapy Programs. Tonight's broadcast topic for me is the one that's probably the easiest to talk about. It's the one that clients want to answer most often. In fact, it came out of a parent meeting in Seattle some years ago where they asked me to present on what are the most common skills and tools that you've seen work for families, you've seen make the biggest difference in families. And I joke around, although it's true, I joke and say I came up with 12 to begin with, but I learned that nobody reads lists past 8 these days. And so I reduced them and combined a couple of them down until I got to the top 8. These are the skills that I've seen make the biggest difference if you allow the skill or the tool to teach you. I want to be clear. The reason that I'm often reluctant to talk about skills and tools simply is because a skill or a tool isn't everything, right? It doesn't do everything for us. I use the analogy of a hammer. A hammer is a wonderful tool. When if put to proper use, can help to build buildings and houses and nail boards together, to take nails out of boards and so on. But a hammer can also be a weapon. You can use a hammer to destroy or to hurt somebody. And so really for me, the rich work is in what's underneath, what's the foundation underneath the skill. But I think about tools as a way of starting to allow something to sink in, a way of being to sink in. One of my favorite quotes was actually written on my 10th grade English wall of my 10th grade class right before I dropped out of high school. And it was a quote from George Orwell. And he said, "But if thoughts can corrupt language, then language also can corrupt thought." So if we follow this logic, we understand that sometimes that what we do changes the way that we think and feel. I've witnessed families improve their compassion, develop healthier boundaries, and gain great insight into their relationships by utilizing some simple communication tools. So it's not the answer, it's not the everything, but if we allow these tools to teach us, then they can be of great value to us. And I've seen people think their way through something by trying to use the tools, and I'll talk about that as we go along tonight. So tonight's broadcast is 8 tools for transforming relationships. The first tool is I statement, speaking in the person singular, right? I feel, I think, I believe. I want, I need. Sometimes we have some shame around speaking in the first person as if we're acting self-centered. Essentially, most of us don't think that it's enough. What we feel, what we need, what we want is enough to justify virtually anything, any boundary that we have, right? Because we grew up in contexts where what we felt wasn't enough. Right? We had to be right. That's kind of the opposite experience of being a person is being right. And so when we grow up in that context, your feelings don't matter, right? That's not enough to set a boundary, justify your behavior. You know, when we talk about in my experience, you know, this is what has worked for me. This way of talking is revolutionary, right? This is the closest that we really can get to advice giving and have it remain healthy, is saying, I don't know what you should do. I don't know what your journey looks like. I can only tell you what's worked for me, what's worked in my experience, what's helped me in similar situations. You know, for me, what has been helpful. Instead of using you statements, you know, describing the other person, their rightness or wrongness, right, correcting them. I remember I had a friend years ago, newly married at the time, and I asked how it was going and how the marriage was, and they said, we have a great relationship. We call each other on our crap. And I thought, that's probably going to get old pretty soon. I didn't say anything. But I said, that probably is going to get old pretty soon. Right? It's not that hard. It doesn't take that much insight to see somebody's quote unquote crap and call them on it. What does take capacity is the ability to see and understand somebody in the process. So It's not attacking. It's not being right. It's the strongest position that we can really take in parenting or in relationships. I tell the story in my book about a father who asked me, that he wanted some research on a specific on marijuana use and the effects on the brain. And I asked him why, and he said, because my young adult son is living in the house, and I want to show them to him. And I said, why don't you just tell him that you're not comfortable? And the father said to me, is that enough? Right? The father's telling me by that question that wasn't enough. It wasn't okay. We think it's a stronger position if we just tell people the way it is, right? This is the way that it is. This is the way that it is about drug use, or about this behavior, about keeping your room clean, about getting your tires changed, right? We just tell them the truth, tell them our truth as if it's the truth. And we imagine that way of talking is unassailable, can't be argued with, when we know very well, on the contrary, it absolutely can be argued with. I remember my wife sent a text home to the babysitter one time and said, tell Livy, our youngest, it's time to go to bed, no excuses. And the babysitter wrote back and said, I told them, and they had excuses. There were excuses, right? We think that just stating it the way it is going to be stronger, when really the strongest position, the most powerful position that we can take is, this is what I feel, this is what I need, this is what I want, this is what I believe. Rationally, that can't be argued with, and it becomes quite obvious to us if somebody tries to talk us out of what we think, feel, and want and need, that it's an insane discussion. So it's the most powerful you can take. The second tool is reflective listening. Sometimes this is called deep listening, active listening. Various groups, models call it different things, but it's deep, profound listening. It's not listening and waiting for a rebuttal, right? It's not being triggered, having reactions, even having an internal debate and retort in our mind. It's really listening to the other person. That quote that I shared last week, to deeply understand and hear something, you often have to lose your mind, right? You've kind of got to kind of clear the space in your brain and just hear the other person. And that's difficult. It's not easy. What's amazing is that your children, it takes them about 2 or 3 weeks, and they get really, really good at this tool, this skill. I remember years ago, I was called to an intervention of a former student of mine, years after his treatment with us. He actually wasn't having the same exact issues that he was having when I treated him, but he had a whole new set of issues that we did not foresee. So the family wanted to bring me in because we had a good connection as part of the intervention. I wasn't running it, but I was part of it. And he walked into the room thinking he was just going over to his mother's for lunch or something. And he saw a group of people, a small group of people, including me. And he was about to walk out, and then he saw me, and I was the one he hadn't seen in the longest time. And he said, I'll stay. And we sat down, and the interventionist turned to the father and said, you've written a letter. And the dad started to read his letter to the son. And the son got up and swore and said, I'm not going to take this. I've heard this before. And I said, just wait 1 second. Remember when you were in wilderness? And remember when you learned after a few weeks just to listen to feedback and to not necessarily assume that it was true, but just to hear somebody else's perspective? They have a saying in the field, if it's let it sit, if it doesn't apply, let it fly. I said, remember when you could do that and you got really good at it? What if you just did that today? And you could just see the switch. And he sat down and he said, okay, I'll listen to it and just hear your perspective. Just hold space for your perspective. And he sat through his father's, his mother's, a couple of other loved ones in the room, myself. And by the end of the day, he was checking himself into a treatment program that dealt with his specific issue that he was struggling with. So we can learn to listen. We can learn to hear. One of my favorite moments was when a father had told me in week 1 and 2 that his son was a complete liar. Everything he said was a lie. He would lie about the color of the sky if we were both staring at it. I saw some of that. in our program. And the son, of course, had a different story, a different perspective on the relationship. And he said, my dad never listens. I shared that idea, that thought with his father on a phone call, and the father said, you know what? Why would I listen to him lie? I'm a great listener, the father said. A fantastic listener. I have to be a good listener at my job. I teach people how to listen. A few weeks passed. The father listened to the broadcasts, read some of the work that we asked him to read about, and came back 4 or 5 weeks in and said, I never realized how poorly I listened to other people. I heard the information, but I didn't deeply listen to understand their perspective. So it's a different quality of listening. The skill can help. Just shutting your mouth can be the start. When the students, clients in the program just shut their mouth and begin to listen so that they can at least reflect back accurately what they've heard, they find that they don't need to be reactive. I play this game in my head that when my wife is talking to me, I try to imagine that she's talking about some other crazy husband that she's married to so that I can just hear her. And in a way, it's true. She's describing her version of me, not the version of me, her version of me. And I can hear that. But I can't hear it when I think it's about me. Right? Then I want to defend, want to dispute the facts, want to share my perspective, my intentions, and so forth. So we don't listen because we have judgments. We're waiting to rebut, for our retorts. We're feeling vulnerable, right? We don't because essentially we don't know that we're okay. If somebody came up to you and said you don't have a nose, and you know you have a nose, you wouldn't argue with them. You would look at them strangely and think, I wonder what's going on for you. I wonder what that means to you. So by holding this kind of space, we help other people move through feelings. I will tell you, and this is very important, I didn't say this the last time I did this broadcast because it hadn't happened. I was in a lot of family therapy with my 6-year-old this summer, in spring of this past year. And I remember in one of the sessions when my 6-year-old was describing something in the family that was partly about me. And I remember thinking, there's no truth to that. That's not true at all. And then I thought, oh, that's what it sounds like to a parent. And then I remembered, I looked at the therapist, and all of this was just silent in my head. I looked at the therapist, listening, asking us to reflect it back. And the therapist, they're not sitting over there assuming that what is being said is the truth. They're just trying to hear what's going on for the child and then have us hear it. It's almost as if they're telling us about a dream that they had about us, right? A fantasy that they have about us. And so it helped me to think about myself as the therapist, because when I hear talking about a parent, when I hear a spouse talking about a spouse, when I hear a parent talking about a child, I run it through the filter that I have that says, I want to hear what your experience is like in this relationship, in this situation. And it's meaningful, and it's important, and it's real. I've also had the experience where after listening to people, after supporting people listening to each other, that over time the shared truth gets closer and closer together. Oftentimes we tend to polarize. Our descriptions of events and situations get exaggerated. If I came home and told you that my boss was slightly disrespectful to me today, and I don't think she was listening to me today, and I told you about some very subtle experience, it would be easy for many people to say, well, your boss might not have been thinking that, or maybe they just didn't hear you. Or gosh, that you might be attributing some intent that's not there. Those kinds of things, right? But if I come home with an exaggerated story about how disrespectful, about how long this pattern has existed, about how she does it to everybody, about what a horrible boss she is, then I have some more confidence that you're going to say, oh my gosh, I don't even know how you deal with that. Right? It goes to the point again is of the idea that is somebody's truth okay? Do we need to justify it? Do we need to pass judgment on it? Do we need to approve of it? Or can they just say, this is my experience. This is what it's like for me. And can we hear that? Do we have the capacity to do that? By doing that, this is how we help other people move through feelings. Right? This is how we teach other people to feel and how we support them. When people get angry at us and hurt with us by what we do, the more that we can contain it, that's the clinical term, the more we can listen, hold it, be patient with it, see it, sit with it. The more that we can do that, the more likely the person is to move through the emotions. When your child is angry at sending them to wilderness, the most effective thing that you can do is have no attachment to that. Let it be. Even say, like, I'm sorry. Maybe it was a mistake. I did the best that I could. Somebody asked me at the parent meeting in New York a month ago, because my son was presenting. I shared this the other night. They said to him and asked me after he left, because he left halfway through the meeting, about if he was ever angry or resentful about it. And he gave his answer, and he said, no, he never really thought that way. And then after he left, I said, it would be strange for my children to be resentful about something like that I did, because it wouldn't matter to me. It would, not that I don't care, but it wouldn't be something that I would be invested in them not feeling. And that's the most helpful thing that we can do. And not all things are like that for me. Not all things are easy for me like that, but that one happens to be easy. Miguel Ruiz in the Four Agreements says, taking this personally is the maximum expression of selfishness, because we make the assumption that everything is about me. Nothing other people do is because of you, it's because of themselves. Right? This is seeing another person. That's why it's vital. That's why it's important that you be seen, that you find people that can see you and contain you, understand you, hear you, support you. So you go there to do that, so that when you show up to the parent-child relationship, that you can be there for the child instead of requiring the child to contain you, to be there for you. In marriage, it's a similar task. I make sure that I'm taking care of myself. Not that my wife doesn't carry me sometimes and I don't carry her sometimes, but I make sure that she's not the only one. That I have somebody in my life, and in my life it happens to be a therapist, that I get to go to be seen, so that when I show up in the marital relationship, I can take turns at containing, take turns at listing, right? I heal and work on my self over here. I can express love, which is a giving thing. The third tool is ask the intention or state the intention. Now, of all the tools on this list, I think it's the least talked about one that I hear communication experts talk about. And yet, if we did it more often, we would avoid so many difficulties in marriage and parenting, especially as your children grow up, especially as they graduate from the program, especially as they start to kind of feel their way through independence, right? And you're not quite sure what role you're to play in a specific conversation. Asking and stating the intention is this. If I'm the person talking, I state my intention. Hey, Mom, I want to tell you about something, but I just want you to listen. Or to my wife, hey, sweetheart, I want to share some frustration that I'm having right now, and I don't need you to fix it. I don't need any suggestions. I just want you to hear it. Can you do that? If I'm on the receiving end, I can ask, if you're sharing something with me, I can say, what would you like from me? Do you want me to just hear this? Do you want me to respond or react? Do you want me to give my thoughts? And be wary, by the way. Most people overestimate their ability to hear somebody's retort. Most of the time, people aren't ready for it. And they don't know that until it's too late. So a good practice, a good discipline is take turns. I say in the book, I don't know if it's 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, but give the expression, the feeling, give it its space. When it's allowed to have its space, and that's going to be determined by each of the people, especially the sender and the communication dynamic, then you can move on to some of these other things. We just had this discussion yesterday. My wife was sharing some things with us, and she said, I want to hear what you're thinking. And I said, my goal is to think nothing except for just to hear what you're saying. And if I come, and we were talking about this both back and forth, if I come back with my thoughts and my ideas, then it can easily be dismissive of what you're thinking and feeling. And so it's not a trick. I'm really trying to just hear you, trying to have no opinion about what you're saying to me about this issue between us. So if you're the receiver, ask before you respond. You might ask on the front end if you know it's going to be an emotional issue. If you're the sender, at any point, ideally you front load it with, I just want to be heard. Can you just hear it? And if the person starts to respond, then you can say, remember. And this is the amazing thing. If you can't hear it, it's okay to say I can't. It's perfectly okay. And you don't deserve to be beat up, because basically what you're saying is, I don't have the psychological energy, the resources right now to do this. I tell the story. I had a conversation standing right on the other side of my desk with my wife a half ago or so. Now it's been. It was a Saturday. I think I just finished an intensive workshop, finishing up some paperwork in my office. And my wife walked into my office. She said, look, I know you've had an intense week. I know you're just finishing up your work. I have an issue I want to discuss with you. Do you have the ability to do that right now? And I thought, and I took the risk, and I said, I don't, not right now. I'd like to relax today, and then if it can wait till. She said, that's perfectly fine. She said, I'll call my friend and talk to her about it, and when you're ready, we can talk about it. And I think both of us did something very unique that we wouldn't have done the first 10 years of our marriage. I took the risk of owning my boundary and my capacity and saying, no, I can't do what you're asking. And she didn't punish me for it. I wasn't a bad husband, an uncaring husband, a husband that dedicated more of his time and resources to others and not to the family. All of those kinds of old arguments that we have. I was just a human husband, unable at that point to respond in the way they needed. I could have tried. I could have lied. That's one of my temptations. And I usually end up feeling resentful or responding in a way that's not helpful, and it goes sideways. Especially if the person feels like they're saying something that looks like it's asking for advice or problem solving, check in with them. If they're being repetitive, if they're saying the same thing over and over again, check in with them saying, I think I'm hearing you, but this is the third or fourth time you're saying it, so what do you need from me? When you state your intention about what you want from the other person, you set both of you up for success. And you start to have integrity between what you want and what you're saying. If I know ahead of time what I need from you, I just want to be heard, or I want to change your mind about something, right? If I really want to change your mind about something, stating the intention is going to expose that, if I'm honest with myself. So this is a fantastic skill that sets you and them up for success. When my wife says to me, can you just listen? I know I'm off the hook. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to respond or change. I just have to hear her, understand her. It really sets me up. And it helps me when I'm on the sending to be really clear. The fourth tool, avoiding imperatives. This is something also that when I ask people, we write this in the hopes and intentions letter. And it is my suggestion that you essentially eradicate these words from your language almost universally. Good, bad, right, wrong, evil. Have to, need to, should, ought to, must. If you just take those out of your dialogues with people, and when there's any kind of emotional content to it, or relational content to it, you will find you start to think about the relationship differently. You have to respect me. No, I need certain things. I want to be treated this way. You start to have to own it. It's more vulnerable, but it's also more powerful. See, wars are being fought over imperatives, over good and bad, right and wrong, have to, need tos, and shoulds. But this kind of differentiated, assertive, empowered, vulnerable, and strong language of I feel, I want, I need, I prefer is much more effective and powerful. It begins to define the relationship in a differentiated way where I am clear about me and I'm clear about the relationship and the separation between us, and I'm about you. It's easier to hear on the receiving end. If somebody starts talking to me about good, bad, right, and wrong, what I should do, somebody comes to me and gives me feedback, it's going to be more difficult than if they say, I felt hurt, I felt sad, I felt confused, I felt frustrated when you said or did this. It's not effortless to hear that sometimes because I still internalize as I did something wrong, right? That's still the temptation, the thing that we stumble over. It's easier. And speaking in I statements instead of imperatives is more accurate of what's really going on in the world, what's really going on in a relationship. I've loved watching it happen through writing therapy. It's probably one of my favorite things about wilderness therapy is the letter writing therapy coaching that we can do. Even when I tell somebody to not use those words, and it's in the instructions in the hopes and intentions letter, or what used to be called the impact letter, um, I do just a quick little edit function on my Microsoft Word, and I look up those words, and I usually find a handful, and so I craft some sentences. I give some examples of the way you might say it differently. Instead of saying you have to go to school, you say something like, here's what I value, here's what I think school can do for you, and here's my boundary around that. If you go, this can happen. Don't go, this will happen. Much, much more clear. But because we don't like the experience of being vulnerable, we make it about the other person and we make it about right and wrong. So of all the ones that's simple but difficult, I think reducing, getting rid of imperatives is that one. Polarizations. I actually think this one is very common. I think this one is well taught, well coached. Research that I've seen in years past shows that families who identify themselves as successful in post-treatment studies say that they avoid polarizations, all or nothing, black and white, either or, always, never. When we talk in those ways with each other, I think we all know that. It's pretty difficult to hear. Again, we do it because it feels more vulnerable to say, if I say to you, you never listen to me, right? Then my anger is absolutely righteous. But if I say to you, last night when we were talking, or this morning when we were talking, I didn't think you were listening to me. It's more vulnerable, right? The voices that we hear when we say things like that is, what's the big deal? Why are you making such a big deal about it? You're too sensitive. You're overreacting, right? And just imagine where those voices came from in our lives, in our history. So we use exaggerated polarizations to justify our righteous hurt and anger and moodiness. It's proving that we have the right to feel what we're feeling. And the difficulty becomes, again, it becomes about a battle about who's right and who's wrong, which nobody wins in that. It becomes a power struggle with each person's right to feel how they feel instead of that right just being granted. It's a lot easier to hear on the receiving end because it doesn't feel like such an indictment. It doesn't feel so heavy. Avoid advice giving. This relates back to some of the other things that I've described in the skills, but avoiding advice giving is the sharing of ideas, thoughts, experiences without the need to be right. In AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, they have a tradition of no crosstalk. Nobody gives advice to anybody. Even if it becomes veiled where somebody shares and then somebody gets up to share, but they're really talking to a specific person, the leader of the meeting will shut that down. So if you go to one of those meetings, what you'll hear is, what works for me? My experience. It may not work for you. The wonderful thing about that kind of talk is that if the other person says, that's the most ridiculous idea that I've ever seen, it's easy to back that off. But if you come on telling the truth about everything, about the way the world works, it's a hard thing to back off of. So your role as a parent, this is a more effective, differentiated way to teach your children. In fact, a lot of times my adult children will ask advice, and I do my very best not to answer. It's a fool's errand to answer advice questions. Right? What should you do? I don't know. I can't possibly know. I barely know what I want to do. How could I know what you should do? I don't know what's going to give you what you need. I can share a similar experience that sounds and looks like yours, and how I felt and how I responded to it, and what that did. I love the example of David Bowie. There was an interview that went around shortly after he passed. It was done by the BBC. It was just a few minutes where he was talking about his alcoholism. And the interviewer was trying to challenge him and say, couldn't you just have one drink? At a wedding, can't you just have a toast of champagne? And David Bowie was saying, I can't. I know what's at stake for me. For me, that doesn't work. I don't know what it's like for other people, but for me, I can't do it. I know myself well enough that that won't work for me. And within a very short period, he said the phrase for me 7 or 8 times. And he was illustrating this way of being in relationship in the world, right? Knowing self being the first kind of goal, and not extending that to assume that I know you're true. In Al-Anon, they say it's not your business to decide whether or not somebody else in your life is an alcoholic or an addict. You could just talk about what you're comfortable with in your boundaries. So you don't have to diagnose your child as an addict or an alcoholic or borderline or anything for that matter. What you can say is, I'm just not comfortable with this, so I'm gonna do this. It's not a passive stance. It doesn't lead to passivity. It leads to assertive, clear, courageous, and authentic responses. Share a story. I think in essence, therapy often starts off with the idea of getting advice, right? Problem solving. And what it evolves into for many people is a different kind of experience than they've had in their life. I joke sometimes and say, you know, our children in the program, they don't need advice. They have parents for that. I joke sometimes, right? They need something else to be heard, to be understood. They need a voice. They need to give a voice to the wounds that the symptoms and the defenses are covering up, are masking. And then they need a safe place to heal. So I've gone to therapy with my current therapist for 20 years now, same therapist. And I don't know that she's given me advice really ever. And I stopped asking a long time ago. Sometimes she'll say something like, you could try this. And sometimes I say, that's a great idea, I might try that. Or I say, I don't think that'll work. And she says, okay. But the idea that somebody else can know your truth doesn't make any sense anymore. Not in this new kind of sensibility. Lecturing, teaching, preaching, repetition, right? All of those become kind of signs of us believing that what we need to do is control the other person. The Dalai Lama said to be aware of a single shortcoming in oneself is more useful than to be aware of 1,000 in somebody else. I want to be clear about you with this too. I want to be clear that this works better than advice. Just pragmatically, this works better than advice. Interacting with people in these ways is more effective at influencing and impacting people than advice, which comes from a place of anxiety, frustration, need for control, right? So if it doesn't seem to line up with your philosophy, just think of it pragmatically. If you think your role is to impart your wisdom to your child, then doing it this way is more effective. You know, sometimes parents say to me, I remember a father said to me one time, what he wanted out of the program is he wanted to get to a place where his son would start listening to him. I said, okay, that's fair. But really what this is going to be about is you being able to listen to him. That's the gold in the parenting relationship. Not the advice you impart. Again, for those of you who were on it in the beginning, if you have an Instagram account, go to Evoke Summit Lodge on Instagram. And the post that was just done this evening was the artwork was by my son and the content was by my daughter. And that wasn't because I told them what to do or gave them advice. They figured that out on their own. But it came to them because it was safe, because they could explore, because they could bounce around, make mistakes, struggle. Compassion to others and self is the seventh tool. It's probably one of the most subtle aspects of this, developing a practice of compassion toward yourself. Because most of us believe, experience, we're taught that we need a good butt kicking when we make mistakes, right? We need to be chastised. We need to hate the sin and love the sinner, as they say. And really, the hatred towards oneself, even one's actions, leads to repression, resistance, denial. It's only when we can have compassion toward our worst self do we start to have some enlightenment on the subject and start to heal the deeper wound. So developing what I call a dear one attitude. I stole that phrase from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk and writer. A dear one attitude. Dear one, I'm here for you. Thich Nhat Hanh says, if we can look at our anger, our anxiety, our depression, like we would a struggling child, and say to it, dear one, I am here for you. If we can look at our narcissism, our insensitivities, the things that we do when we are hurt and we lash out at others, if we can look at that with compassion, we can listen to it, understand it, get from it the wisdom that it's trying to tell us. We can heal it. And instead of cutting the weeds off at the surface, we really get to the root of the matter. And we know what happens when we cut off the top of the weed, right? That's akin to focusing on behavior change in our children or in ourselves or in others. It shows up some other way. If we apply enough force to a situation, sometimes we can get the behavior go away. But if we haven't dealt with the root issue, it's going to pop up some other time, some other way. Chasing away our woundedness or others' woundedness with hate, anger, or disgust just doesn't work. It's just shame or guilt. I remember when I was getting divorced. At the time, I practiced a certain religion, and I went to my religious leader, and I told him, we had this session, and I told him that I was getting a divorce. And he said to me, basically, well, now you're going to be responsible for your children's sins. Their sins will be on your head. And I thought about that for a second, and I said, well, my father really wasn't there for me at all. And this happened to me when I grew up. So I guess my sins are on his head. So I'll just pass them up the chain. And I wasn't trying to be sarcastic. I was just saying, I don't know that it works that way. See, the lens of mental health is not a lens of good and bad and right and wrong. The lens of mental health is woundedness versus healing, broken versus repaired, right? We look at behavior the same way we would a medical doctor would look at a broken leg. They're not mad at it. They just want to heal it. So they do what they need to do to help it to heal. And that's why I love the mental health lens, is because it relieves the pressure that comes from other constructs, from other lenses that feels so oppressive. It's taken me a long time as a client in therapy to make this shift in my own life. I was capable of making it with others first, but it really wasn't until I started to do it with myself that everything changed, and that my compassion for others deepened greatly. I remember some years ago somebody did something to me that was very hurtful, and a common friend that we had were talking about it a year or two later, and she was talking about her anger and resentment toward this person, what he had done, and I said, I don't have those feelings towards him. I think he was just scared and hurt and sad. And she said to me, well, you're a better person than I am. And I said, I don't think it's that. I think it's about being a better person. I've just been doing some work lately in the past few years, and I've realized that if I have to hate him for what he did to me, then I have to hate myself too. So I had a choice to make, to hate us both, or to learn to love us both. I didn't like what he did. I didn't want what he did to happen. It didn't not hurt. I just didn't turn it into something that I hated. And that's what I think therapy can do for us, right? It's not an imperative. It's not that I just took the high road. It's that it didn't actually lead me to be angry and to hate him. You know, we look deeply into our past, into our childhood. If we have the courage to walk past the sentinels of guilt and shame and familial obligation, to see what really happened, to learn where we were wounded, we'll come to understand ourselves better and our limitations. And I think it's from that place that we could develop the courage to make difficult decisions, to set difficult boundaries, to interact with our partners, our spouses, our children, our friends in a more compassionate, whole, courageous, authentic way. The Buddha is credited often for saying, if our compassion does not include ourselves, it's incomplete. I've seen some debate online that came from Jack Kornfield, but the point is still true. Right? Hatred is not the answer to hatred. Only it doesn't drive out hatred. Only love can do that. Darkness can't drive out darkness. Only light can do that. That's Martin Luther King. So I know it seems to work sometimes, and I know in the short term, shame, guilt, anger, fear, all can be very powerful and potent motivators. But in the long game, for all of us, ourselves, our children, everybody, they're not the thing that works. The last tool that I put on the list of 8 tools, the 8th tool, is the timeout. Because fact of the matter is, all of us are going to at times be tested beyond our ability to respond in all of these ways, right? When I was working with men who were convicted of domestic violence, we would teach timeouts as a part of the process. And I learned a few things. Number one, by the time we would have them come up with an anger scale from 1 to 10 and begin to identify really low levels of anger, like things like bothered or annoyed, all the way up to a 10, which might be rage. Or they could use words like seeing red, out of body, kind of seeing red. They got to come up with their own labels. And then we would say to them, try to practice taking timeouts when you get to a 4 or 5 at the latest. And I found a couple things out. None of them ever wanted to do it. They never wanted to take timeouts when they were at a 4 or 5. But I also found out that when you're at an 8 or a 9 or a 10, you don't care about timeout anymore. You've been hijacked by the primitive brain, by the fight or flight part of your brain, and all reason is gone. So the key is to learn to take timeouts earlier, to learn to recognize your anger. And no matter who you are, no matter how enlightened you are, no matter how many tools you have, no matter how much therapy you have, there are going to be times still, at least in my experience, from what I've seen, all types of people, that you're at times going to get pushed, triggered to an 8, 9, or 10. Right? That's going to happen. And so learning to see that ahead of time. The difficulty is that we don't want to take timeouts at a 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5. Because why? The answer is because it feels vulnerable and weak. If I need a timeout, if I, Brad, need a timeout, I am saying I can't handle it. I am owning my lack of capacity. And I don't like that. As I start to feel upregulated, agitated, right? I don't want to own. I don't want to be vulnerable. I want to make it about you and your problem and why you're being a jerk. And by the way, you need to go on a timeout. If you have the thought that somebody needs a timeout, it's probably you. Because really what we're saying to the other person is, you know what? You better leave this conversation right now, because if you don't leave it, I'm about to say something you're not going to like, and I'm not going to like. So having the courage to own it is very, very difficult. But I've learned in my life that it invariably helps. And it's something that we resist so strong. See, the men that I worked with, they demonstrated something called the cycle of violence. Very popular, very simple model. 3 stages of the cycle of violence. The violent act, right? The hitting, the violence. The second stage was the honeymoon, right? Give them flowers, apologize. I'll never do this again. Let's go to therapy. I'm sorry. And then the third stage is the tension building stage. Now, those are the 3 stages, and they go in a circle. Violence, honeymoon, tension building. Violence, honeymoon, tension building. And they stay stuck in that. And they stay stuck in it because they try not to be angry. That's why they get stuck in it. They try not to feel anger because they associate, well, last time I was angry, I got violent and I regretted it. It doesn't work that way. Interestingly, in the study that I did with the men that I worked with, we saw that sometimes the victims of the violence would stand in the way of the man when he was trying to leave, because to them it felt too threatening to be left, too scary, too potentially final and absolute. Didn't happen in all the cases, but in a statistically significant amount of the cases, that behavior was present. So to get out of the cycle in our lives of these unhealthy dynamics, these fights, whether even if they're not violent, is to take a timeout, to own and to sit with your anger, to listen to it. Because in an upregulated situation, none of us are going to have access to the wisdom that we have when we're not upregulated. My therapist says, strike while the iron is cool, right? That adage of don't go to bed angry, that's ridiculous. It's okay to go to bed angry, because sometimes that's going to prevent a really unpleasant argument debate. It's okay to lose the battle to win the war. So timeout is the last thing on this list, because it's the thing that brings us back to the capacity of all the other things. Rudolf Dreikurs, a famous child psychologist, said it this way: the proper way of training children is identical to the proper way of treating fellow human beings. Right? All of this is true. This is about what it means to be a human being in relationship to other human beings. The above tools that I've talked about today are about changing our sensibility. It's a lifelong project of changing the way we are in the world. From my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, I describe the transformation as changing the question from what do I do to the series of questions to be answered in this order. Who am I? Who is my child? And what is my relationship to their problems? You know, I talk about what therapy is. And for those of you who are watching visually, I'll show you. And for those of you who are listening on the podcast app, I'll describe it. Imagine taking my two fists out in front of me like this. They're about 8 to 10 inches apart. Okay? And the right fist represents what I'm inclined to do, what my natural inclination or response is, what I did yesterday. And the left fist represents 10 inches away, represents what my higher self would do, my more enlightened self, my wiser self, my more capable self would do. And the distance in between those two places is therapy. That's our work. When people ask me, what's my work? What do you mean when you talk about me doing my work? It's building that bridge between what you're inclined to do, what your natural inclination is, and what you know to do. What you know will be more helpful, more healthy, more productive to do. And the larger the space in between, the more work that you have. And it's a lifelong project, right? That bridge never gets perfectly and absolutely crossed, but we make progress. All right. Our new format is you send in questions now and comments now while I'm going through the upcoming information. And then at the end, I'll take those questions from Alex, the moderator this evening, and I'll answer them. So we want all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Any version of Al-Anon, Code of Families Anonymous. Alateen is for teenagers if you have a sibling that wants to go. You can also go to Adult Children of Alcoholics. Go online, search there, find meetings in your area. Refuge Recovery is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program that can be helpful, that doesn't necessarily have the same emphasis on a higher power. NAMI.org is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have chapters, local chapters in all of your areas that help you with resources and classes that are affordable or free. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app on an iPhone by searching Evoke Therapy Programs, on an Android device using the SoundCloud app by searching Evoke Therapy Programs, or going online on any computer to soundcloud.com and searching Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle Evoke Therapy. Also, like I said earlier, follow us at Evoke Summit Lodge. Also, I'm going to add that to this announcement from now on. And you can see tonight, if you go on tonight, the little story that my daughter and my son came up all on their own. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also find the Alumni Foundation on Facebook by searching Evoke Family Foundation. Our blog has updated content constantly. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. If the warehouse is out, you can go to the new options underneath the paperback tab, and you can buy directly from Evoke Therapy Programs. The next Finding You with a Spot will be March 27th. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, this is a great place to do it. Email us at intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information and to find out about upcoming months and schedule. I'll be at the Southern California Parent Support Group on February 24th from noon to 3. Notice the new time. We did it so that you could be home in time to watch the Academy Awards and not run into traffic. So it will be preceded by a potluck lunch, and then we're going to be discussing the book Rising Strong by Brene Brown. I will be in the Bay Area on Thursday, February 28th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. Contact Bonnie at evoketherapy.com to RSVP or to find more information. We ask all current parents to go to a workshop. The next one is this weekend, the 16th and 17th in Oregon. If you haven't signed up yet, you're probably not going. But the following one is March 23rd and 24th in our Southern Utah program. Again, at evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. Our pursuit trips are family trips, adventure trips all around the world, service trips, custom built for families or young adults. Think therapy light, reconnecting to therapy, recalibration. All right. One of the questions is, I had a bullet point on there that said, can you clarify the unfinished business intervention? I wish I could. I couldn't remember what that was, so I skipped it. Sorry about that. What does upregulate mean? It means to have intense feelings of anxiety, anger, frustration. So those feelings that tend to hijack our rational thinking, that we tend to be irrational, reactive, typically upregulated. It refers to anxiety, but it can be anger, frustration, agitation, other feelings too. And then somebody's asking to bring up the slide with the entire list on it. Absolutely happy to do that. By the way, I should note that there's a blog on this too. So if you go to my page on our website, go to find me, and then click on Brad's blogs. I did this one a year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. You can have the entire blog that goes through all of these points. So there's now 2 webinars. There now will be 2 podcasts, and there's also a blog on it if you want more. Can you give examples of how to do each step? Sure, real quickly, I can run through them. An I statement is, I don't feel comfortable with doing drugs. I can't have them in my house, and so you can't live here, or I have to leave if it's a spouse. Reflective listening is just that. It's just listening and saying, I hear you. What you're saying is that you're frustrated, that you're angry. Asking or stating the intention, I think I gave examples of, I want to share something with you and I just want you to listen. Or I want you to listen, but then I would like to do some problem solving after that. Or that's stating the intention. Asking the intention is when somebody says something to you, you check in with them and say, what would you like from me? Do you want me to just hear this? Do you want me to give you my response? Do you want me to problem solve this with you? Avoiding imperatives is just not using those words. Avoiding polarizations is just not using the all or nothing words. Avoiding advice giving is saying, this is my experience. This is what I found that works for me. I don't know if it'll work for you. Or you might try this. I don't know if it'll work, but you might try it. I've had some success with it. Compassion to others and self is kind of a silent thing. It's not using shoulds that apply to self. Instead of saying, I hate when I do that, we say, I notice that I do that, and I wonder why. I wonder where that comes from. Right? I don't follow through on my boundaries. Instead of saying I'm so stupid, I'm horrible, I'm bad at this, we say, I want to explore why that's hard for me. Because that came from somewhere. I wasn't born with that. I learned that somehow in this world. And time out is just saying, I need to take some time. I can't do this right now. I'm getting overwhelmed. Or I need some time. We'll talk later. I will come back to this. I'll initiate this discussion again, but I need to take some time away. As a sibling of an Evoke participant, how can other children support their parents as they work and struggle with these tools? I think that's a great question. Just learn as much as you can. Just start to step into this work and apply it to yourself. And talk about the best thing that we can do with our loved ones to support them is to share our own process. Like, this is what I'm learning. I don't do this well, right? The best way, let me put it to you this way. The best way to encourage somebody else to take off their armor or their defenses is for you to take off your armor and defenses first. So talk about what you don't know. Talk about making mistakes. Talk about what you're learning. Ask questions and be curious. I used to have a therapist that worked for us for years. She would always say, just remain curious. She would tell the parents, just remain curious with your children. And I thought that was such a fantastic advice. Like, I wonder why. But and not in some kind of, I wonder why you do that, shaming kind of tone, but I really do wonder why. I'd like to understand. So being open yourself is the best way to support others in your family and their openness and their growth. And sharing what you're learning and what old ideas that you're destroying and getting rid of is a great way to make it to support other people in your family that are going through the growth process. So thank you for that question. Somebody said, I did, because I like comments too. Somebody said, I hand out these 8 tips and the blog that goes along with it like candy to anyone that might listen. In my experience, these tips are magically effective in situations that seem hopeless at times at first. Thank you so much for compiling them. They have been life-changing. I'm very happy. For me, I think this is the most practical, pragmatic set of tools and concepts that I know of. And again, I've had the wonderful gift of a lifetime to be able to sit and watch families struggle through pain, difficulty, grief, and healing. And it's from that perspective that I've compiled this list. In other words, they have taught me this list over the 23 years of my practice as a wilderness therapist. Another parent asks, how do you avoid imperatives when you have a belief in good and evil or right or wrong, but not sharing those beliefs? I seem to be true to myself. It seems not to be true to myself. Well, that's a really fair question. You know, I asked my therapist some years ago. Somebody asked me a question from a context. They talked about how they were getting different information from their rabbi or their priest or their pastor. I can't remember what religious sect it was at the time. And the therapist said, well, the wonderful thing is you're not a priest, Brad. You're not a pastor. You're not a rabbi. And so you don't have to answer to that. You just get to talk about it through the therapist's lens, through the psychological lens. And so my answer is, in the psychological lens, you don't know their truth. You know your truth. I had a family. This is a great example. I had a family a couple of years ago. We were doing a family session. And the parents were talking about their family's values. Right? They were talking about right and wrong and family's values and honesty and things that I think most of us would identify with. And at one point, their teenage daughter said, those aren't family values. Those are parental values. And I thought, you know, she's right. That was a really clear way to say that. They aren't necessarily her values. Some of them are, but some of them are not. And so you can have your values. You can say, this is what's true for me. For me, I value honesty. For me, I value authenticity. For me, I value compassion, right? Those are true for me. I don't know if they're going to be true for you. You have to figure that out. And again, in my experience, approaching somebody with that kind of differentiation and that kind of clarity is the best way to stoke and encourage the kind of virtues that you want for them. But it comes from them, and it's authentic. It's not superimposed. It's not what clinicians call introjections, which means that's a psychological defense where somebody swallows something whole without really considering it, right? That's where we end up at times in our lives of questioning, how did I get here? How did I end up in this job or in this relationship or in this situation? I'm not sure this is me. So it's just not the language. In my experience, in my model, it could be in other people's models. In my model, it's not the language of truth. Rumi talks about it. The great poet Rumi says, you know, out beyond the land of wrong and right doing, there's a field and I will meet you there. The philosopher Kahlil Gibran in the book The Prophet, in the chapter on good and evil, says the same kind of thing. He says, when you're doing good, you're good, but when you're not evil, you're just broken. And he gives several examples of that. So philosophers also have this kind of thing, and it doesn't lead to amorality in my experience. It leads to more morality and a higher morality, and a morality that's more authentic and deep-seated. So that's my answer. It doesn't have to be yours, but it's my answer. All right, looks like we have no further questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for and on behalf of your children of your being willing to step into this work. I haven't decided on the topic. That's the wrong date. For next Wednesday. It'll be the 20th. So next Wednesday, the 20th, I will announce a topic sometime before that and let you know. So yeah, we'll go from there. Thanks again for joining us. I hope these are helpful points of contact for you. I hope the podcasts are helpful in the sense that I hope it gives you another medium to be able to kind of develop this new sensibility that your children's mental health issues, addiction issues require for you to develop. I hope it does that for you. I know for me, it does, just spending this time with you. Thanks for this evening. I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.